Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Okay, so we're thrilled to have Nancy Bain back. Yay! From Kansas.
Okay, I'm done. That was good enough.
She is going to be talking about communities, relationships, and industries creating contexts through social media.
All right, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you my entire career in 45 minutes, basically, is what I'm going to do. That's the plan. I'm just working on it. I really hate podiums. All righty, so totally fun to be here, especially on an occasion such as this, and thank you for coming and all of that stuff. So, like I said, what I actually really do want to do is to try to give you the big picture of where I come from and what I do and how I approach these kinds of questions and why I care about social media and how a communication perspective, or at least the communication perspective out of which I come, addresses social media kinds of questions. So by virtue of the fact that I'm covering a really wide range of things, I'm not going to go particularly deep into anything, but hopefully there'll be lots of times for questions. And I'm around all day, so grab me and we can follow up on things. So I want to start with 4 quotes out of works from thinkers that have been really seminal in shaping how I think about things. So first we have the fabulous Bakhtin, who, if you don't know about Bakhtin at all, he was a Russian who did his work mostly in the 1920s. He was exiled to Siberia. Nobody's quite sure exactly what he wrote, what he didn't. A lot of his work was lost when he ran out of rolling papers in Siberia and used half of his manuscripts to make cigarettes. And that which remains was not translated into English until the 1980s. But he's got this incredible essay, my favorite essay ever, because I am geeky enough to have a favorite essay, called The Problem of Speech Genres. And what he does in that essay is to react against the idea that language should be thought of as an abstract set of symbols that are connected through the logic of grammar and that are some sort of abstract system. And instead what he wanted to do was to argue that language is something that we do. And the basic unit is not the sentence, the basic unit is the utterance, what we say in conversation. So he was planting language as a social, situated activity that speaks to prior contexts and creates new ones. So this quote, for me, is a very powerful one, because if you think about this in contrast to the question of sort of how do words use syntax to combine into grammatical sentences, and then think instead of how does an utterance speak back to all the prior utterances that have come before and toward all of those that it opens up the possibility of creating, it's a real shift in how you think about language, from thinking about it as an abstract system to a practical, situated activity. Anything else I want to say about that? Yeah. Goffman, of course, another favorite, and a similar sort of a point, in that he says an utterance does not carve up the world beyond the speaker into recipients and non-recipients, but it opens different structural possibilities. So again, you have that idea that by speaking, we are not just communicating symbols. What we are doing is creating relationships and opening up different relational possibilities every time we talk, and different social possibilities each time that we talk. So this is what really interests me, is this question of how is language creating different possibilities in the future? How is it bringing context into being rather than simply reflecting what's come prior? Eleanor Oakes is a linguistic anthropologist who has a lot of really, really brilliant work. And she's responding to a somewhat different set of arguments, right, and saying that language needs to be studied as not just as a symbolic system that encodes local, social, and cultural structures, which is itself sort of a leap forward to say language embodies local social and cultural structures, so that what we say, if you look at language, you can read in that local codes of this is how we are, this is who we are, this is what we believe, this is our value system, these are our norms, these are our standards, these are the in-jokes that we're all going to get, the power dynamics that structure our society and so on. But it also brings new ones into being. So again, that emphasis on both reflecting what's come prior, but also projecting what is possible in the future, being brought into being through communicative acts. And then finally, Geertz, who in his really key work, Thick Description, he's got a lot of beautiful, beautiful lines in this work. But this one, Small Facts Speak to Large Issues Because They Are Made to, is another one that I find very powerful. And his point is that we can go look very closely at very small things, like a moment in conversation, or in his case, a Balinese cockfight, or something small like that. And because, as Bakhtin said, it's a link in a chain and it reflects back to all those prior links, we can read much larger social cultural issues within it. So I know Mary spoke last week arguing that anthropological data is big data, ethnographic data is big data, and I would echo that, and I would say even in its smallest form, even if you're looking just at a few utterances, you can read so much into it. And it's not because it's coincidence, it's not because it's reference, it's because that's how society works. That's how we bring ourselves into being, right? We're not handed a manual, hello, this is your introduction to society, here's your social cultural information. We have conversations, and that's how we learn it. And people rarely sit us down and say something like, you know, it's really important that you understand the nuances of the power structures here, so I'm going to explain in tremendous detail exactly how it works. These are things we pick up by virtue of having conversations. And usually we actually only discuss those kinds of things when the conversation has broken down or the relationship has broken down. And most of the time, it's just by virtue of doing other things that society comes into being. And so language, when I think about language, when I think about communication, reference is interesting, syntax is marginally interesting, but what are all of the social meanings that have gotten encoded in this, and what are the social possibilities that it opens up through its enactment, are the questions that really, really get to me. So then you get the question, why social media? I love this image. This is after the San Francisco earthquake. It's the San Jose Library. And what I like about it is that for me it resonates with what's interesting about social media, which is that it's a disruptive moment. When social media or any new communication technology come along, it's a point at which the books fall off the shelf, and you can put them back exactly where they were, but you can also think, hey, maybe we could have a new organizational scheme, right? Maybe we should get some new, what are we doing with shelves anyway? Maybe we could rethink all of this. So some of the old stuff stays in place, but it's in contrast to most everyday conversations, you've got much more potential for change and for new ways of doing things to get established when you're dealing with a new communication technology. And this is not unique to social media. This was true of the telephone, this was true of the telegraph, this was true of the alphabet. This has always been true and will always be true of social technologies. So I don't really see, I mean, social media is this moment. In 20 years, we may be talking about something else, but these same issues will always be at play around how do new technologies disrupt the social meanings we've taken for granted, and how do they open possibilities for new ones. So if we take this long view of the work that I've done, these are kinds of the theoretical issues that have driven it and that make it so interesting for me. So it was kind of interesting thinking about this talk because it sort of forced me to go, okay, what is the storyline that runs through all of the work that I've done? And how can I break a series of projects into sort of movements in my oeuvre? I didn't really think that, but I said it anyway. Roughly, I would say you could think of the work that I've done as having three phases, the first of which was studying one online fan community, the second of which was moving into looking at personal relationships and the role of technologies in them, and the third of which has been looking at issues around music flows and audience musician industry relationships, hence the community relationships industries title. So first I'll say a word about methods. Some of you met Annette when she was here the other day. Annette Markham and I edited this book recently about qualitative methods and the internet. Generally, I am a qualitative scholar. I use ethnography. I use discourse analysis. These are if you think about the theoretical claims I've just been making, the obvious thing that follows is looking really closely at language will get you to where you want to be. So I tend to be very focused. So for example, even when I interview, I'm I'm interested in what are they talking about, what are the topics they raise, what are the points they're making, but I'm also really interested in how exactly did they word it, because that's where, for me, the real meat of things come in. So for instance, if I'm interviewing somebody via Skype chat and they put the word fans in quotation marks, for me that's gold, right? That quotation mark says, oh my gosh, there's the, we're at a moment of change where this old word doesn't work anymore. So those details of how language works are really important to me. I'm not a methodological purist. I like numbers, and I have done. It depends on the question, right? So sometimes I'm interested in how does this affect that, and then interviews aren't really a good way to get there. Discourse analysis isn't necessarily a good way to get there. So with collaborators, I've done things that are. Well, I'm talking to some of you are statisticians, so I won't get too, probably stats 101, but, but I don't mind statistics. I like them. They're really handy for some things. So now with that said, let's go back in time. You may remember the late 80s and early 90s, which is when I first found the internet. And Usenet Newsgroup. So this is a map of Usenet that was done by Mark Smith's group at Microsoft in Redmond, back when that existed. So this is a map of the whole Usenet hierarchy as it was at that time. And if you think about it, every single one of those boxes is a group, a discussion forum. And every single one of those discussion forums, language is their medium. That's what they've got. They don't have shared space. They can't point and say that or this. They don't know necessarily what one another look like because it was textual. But every single one of those, you could go in and there was sort of a culture happening. There were things that this is how this group works, this is who we are, this is how we do things. Oh, you're obviously an outsider, we're insiders. Every group had its history. So for me, this was really a fascinating problem because for the reason that here was a place, it was like a natural laboratory. If you were interested in how does language create context, that was the only tool they had. I was taking all these courses, they were saying, well, 68% or 97%, people always come up with these numbers for things that can't be measured, of meaning is communicated non-verbally. But we don't know how to measure that, we don't know how to record that, we don't know how to analyze that, so we're just going to look at the language. And I always thought, well, isn't that kind of like a huge lie? But here was a place where language really was all there was. So for me, that was just really fascinating because it wasn't a lie. Language was the tool through which you could build culture. So I got interested in this one group that was up in there somewhere, Rec Arts TV Soaps, which was a really popular one, an early one. Had the unusual quality of, since they were talking about soap operas, was a predominantly female group in a time when the internet in general still had a big gender disparity. So the group I was looking at was called Rec Arts TV Soaps, or RATS, and the question was basically how do they build social context through language? So it ended up in this book, Tune In, Log On, which was published much later than it should have been in 2000. And in it, I addressed questions of community that applied, I think, very broadly to all kinds of online communities and still get used to talk about all kinds of online communities. So how does this group develop social norms? How do they create a sense of friendship? How do people within it develop an individualized identity? How does the group come to a sense of this is who we are? But also questions about audience that I've come back to in recent years around questions of how does interpretation become a collaborative practice? You know, we always had people talking about the soap operas at work the next day, for example, but suddenly you have thousands of people talking about the soap operas together. What kinds of criticism are audiences engaged in, and also what kind of creative practices are audiences engaged in, which has obviously become something that has become much more prevalent and visible in recent years than it was back then. And I'll get back to that. So I just want to give you two examples from the group to show you what I'm talking about in terms of how social context is brought into being through language. So remember when the internet used to look like this? Okay, so here we have an embedded conversation where the background to this story is that Natalie, nicknamed Nat on the show, nicknamed Not by the group, which I will talk about Natalie had just been recast and people didn't like the new actress, so they were calling her Not instead of Nat, which is brilliant in all kinds of ways. I mean, that says a huge amount right there, just that they can say not, right? And it immediately indexes, we don't like this recasting, we disapprove, this is not Nat. So the first, Natalie has been blinded and kidnapped by a serial woman abuser named Carter, who in disguise as Kyle gave her a ride and has abducted her and taken her to a houseboat where he is being bad. It was not a storyline that the audience liked very much. So the first part, I understand your outrage. It ticks me off too, that not, especially since Not sort of let this happen to her. This is challenged by another speaker. I don't get it, Liz. How do you figure that Nat let this happen to her? Somebody else steps in and says, I know what she meant. She means Not actually went for a ride by Kyle by her own free will. She shouldn't ought to have done that. And then she references back to a discussion they've had that the whole storyline was ripping off Cape Fear anyway. And then somebody else comes in and says, I'm sorry, Anne, my buddy, but I have to disagree with both you and Liz. It's not Nat's fault that she's in this situation. It's entirely Carter's fault for deceiving her. So disagreement, for one thing, is a really interesting communicative genre, especially in a group that values friendliness. If you're committed to, we are a group of friends who watch the show together, which was sort of the psychology of the social context this group had created. And another element of the social context the group had created was we're a group that values a diversity of perspectives. That's the beauty of having thousands of people watching the soaps together. And soaps as a genre are designed to open up multiple perspectives and to have no one meaning, but for people to be able to disagree about them, so they talk about them. And I can talk about that a lot more, but I won't. So disagreement is really interesting. How do you simultaneously open up a variety of diversity of perspectives and value that, and at the same time say, we're all about being friendly. So it's a genre that calls for particularly strategic interaction. Let me put it that way. So if you look at this post, you can see a lot of strategies that are being used to attain both of those things. So I've mentioned Not, but you have, in this final response, you've got an apology, right? A disagreement that begins with apology. You have a lot of use of first names of other speakers, which speaks to the creation of individual identities for people. So Liz and Anne and I guess just Liz and Anne are referenced.
Was it, I don't remember, but was it unusual at that point that news groups used real names?
That's an interesting question. This group had a very strong ethos of using real names. And in fact, if nobody used, even if most of the email addresses would be like, you know, ab3175 at and at nasa.gov, for example. Because at this time, this was before AOL had gatewayed, so this was still, you were at universities or government labs, basically, if you had access to the internet in the first place. And this group did have, and that's another social practice that's a really important one, they definitely had an ethos of we are a real name community. And if somebody would post and they wouldn't sign a name and they were a new person, somebody would actually come on and say, who are you? Please introduce yourself. And in an era before social network sites, this group actually put together a yearbook where we all sent pictures of ourselves and self-descriptions to a central person who made color Xeroxes and put them in a binder and snail mailed them back to everybody so that we could see one another. So that's a great question and an important point as well. But my buddy, obviously facilitating friendliness. Also things like when she positions her disagreement as something that she has to do, right? I have to disagree. So it's not that she wants to challenge you for kicks, it's that she has to. And then she provides a rationale for why she's disagreeing. She doesn't just say, you're stupid, no, that's wrong. And if you think about sort of Godwin's law and how quickly things devolve into flame wars on the internet, you know, she doesn't come in there and say, you know, you freaking Nazi, you're an idiot. She comes in here and she uses an incredible amount of politeness and buffering in order to make sure that her disagreement is positioned as friendly while opening up a diversity. And the other thing that I think is interesting about this is that it speaks not just to the interpretation of this storyline, but to the positions of women in society, the culpability of women in their own abuse, all of those kinds of social issues around gender and culture and violence and domestic violence and so on. And in fact, throughout this discussion, you had people saying things like, well, I know when my husband was beating me, here's how I handled it, which is part of why it was so important to create a really friendly environment, because in order to interpret soaps well, people have to be able to bring their own personal experiences about things that are emotionally and relationally challenging to bear on interpreting it. So you have a lot of issues that transcend the show and the group that are really large cultural issues at play here.
Is this a moderated conversation?
No.
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 This is just...
Yeah, and it, you know, numbers were hard to get. I had 10 months of, I had all of the messages for 10 months, which was 72,000 messages, and about 1,200 different posters in that time. And who knows how many we're reading, but hundreds of thousands, presumably. It was one of the first Usenet groups. It went back really far. Humor was also super important, and this was a great example. I thought of a humorous post. One of these women is not like the other, and then somebody responds, one of these things is not like the others. You recognize this from Sesame Street, those of you who... and then she lists 4 female characters, Natalie, whom we just met, Angelique, Haley, and Dinah Lee, and the answer is Dinah Lee, that All My Children writers have not yet turned her into a sniveling, whining, male-dependent, helpless female character yet, but then she's only been in Pine Valley for a day. So if you look at this message, you have, for one thing, you have humor, you have criticism, and the humorous use of criticism. You have this fan creativity of creating jokes. You have a fun use of formatting as a means of doing it, so playing with the possibilities of the medium, even at a time when it was green text on screen. Again, you have these references to larger gender politics, and you have a defining the group as we are strong, independent, self-sufficient women who object to the show's representation of women as sniveling and whining and male-dependent. So you have a critique of the show and of the gender politics of the show being used to build a group identity of this is who we are, and we are not like that. And you also had the group giving one another a lot of support. So when I mentioned things like that they would talk about their own abuse, that would often evolve into, and now I work at the shelter, and if any of you are having these kinds of issues, find the shelter in your community. There are resources to help you. It's really important that you leave. And if you've left, it's really important that you find ways to give back and to help other women in these situations. So there was a whole gender politics issue going on under the guise of talking about soap operas. The woman who posted this is doing a lot of things to establish her own individual identity. She's being funny, which is a great way to establish an identity, especially in a sort of anonymous space. She's referencing a shared identities that speak to the larger group of people who would recognize Sesame Street, which is, of course, not universal. People who would recognize that one of these things is not like the other's song. So she's referencing a particular generation, a particular age group, and she's also referencing being a parent of young children, which she was and which many of the other people in the group were. So there's a lot of identity work going on here. So these are all examples to show how small facts, like the use of not, or the use of she's not a whiny, snivelly, male-dependent, helpless character yet. These are small facts that speak to very, very large issues, right? And in post after post after post, they cumulatively build an incredible social context. Alrighty. Moving right along. Okay, fine, we'll move along this way then. Come on, mouse. There we go. All right. So around the time I was finishing this work, the HomeNet project at Carnegie Mellon was really zooming along, and I remember I believe it was 1998, maybe it was 99, opening the New York Times, and there below the fold on the front page was a big headline that said, "Researchers discover lonely world in cyberspace." And this was based on Crowd et al.'s finding that in the first year of internet use, when they went into homes and gave people the internet, their loneliness scores increased. Now, there's a lot of criticisms to be made of that study, a lot of them. But what sort of hit me over the head was, wow, that is so out of touch with everything that I've been studying for the last decade, with everything I'm seeing in my own life, with everything I'm seeing in the lives of the people around me using the internet. I didn't buy it. I didn't buy it. And I still don't buy it. It was based on a deterministic claim that the technology causes particular social outcomes, and if you use this technology, then these things will happen to you, which I find incredibly problematic, and which led me to an explicit interest in what are the kinds of messages about social media that are out there in the environment. Why is this on the front page of the New York Times? Right? And my work wasn't. Actually, my work did end up in the New York Times, which my grandmother, anecdote, my grandmother grew up in Manhattan, lived in Manhattan all her life, and read the New York Times literally until the day she died with a highlighter when she started getting senile to make sure she didn't miss any important points. And when she and my grandfather stopped going out of the apartment because they were a little old, then they divided up the New York Times so they never read the same articles and would always have something to discuss. So when I ended up in the New York Times, my grandmother said, "Oh, you're not our little Nancy anymore, you're Ms. Bame now." So what are the messages that circulate about the internet in popular media? And also, how is social media playing out? How does it affect other modes of interaction? How does it affect the quality of conversation? How does it affect the quality of relationships? So I spent most of the first half of the last decade, I guess we're in the decade since, looking at these kinds of questions. There's this really nice book put together by Marita Sturken and Doug Thomas called Technological Visions, The Hopes and Fears That Shape New Technologies, looking at these questions around rhetorics of new technology. And this quote, which I hope resonates for you with the quotes I put up at the beginning, "The desires of a particular age are revealed through the language that is used to talk about new technology and the images used to represent technology. This rhetoric is not simply a means to characterize new technology. It serves to define new technologies and to construct them. They determine how these technologies are used, understood and imagined, and the impact they have on contemporary society." So again, we see language positioned as, it's not that technologies have effects, it's that technologies result from language. People have conversations which lead to technologies coming to exist in the first place, and then people have conversations about technologies. Technologies are marketed, technologies are represented, technologies are understood, and things that are better technologies flop, in part because of the social dynamics that happen around their introduction into society. And lousy ones succeed for those same reasons. And people fear technologies they needn't, and so on. Yes, Butler?
Feel free to reject this question, but what's the connection between this story and the social construction of technology?
They're the same story.
Really?
Well, in many ways.
That seems to mostly be about the people who are making the technology.
It extends it beyond, it says, okay, social construction of technology is part of the process, right? So when we say constructing new technologies, that's the social construction of new technologies piece. But it also talks about after the technologies exist and how discussion around those technologies affects the way that they become domesticated or become ordinary and taken for granted, and why we stop talking about them and how we come to shared understandings of them. So it speaks to social construction of technology often gets understood for, I think sometimes it's a somewhat oversimplistic understanding of it to say technologies are created by society, end of story. And this position, I would say, thinks of it as more of a back and forth between technologies and discourse about them, that they influence one another. So I think it still puts some, or at least the way I think about it, you still can talk about the technologies themselves offering particular affordances or making some things possible and other things challenging, but that whatever the technology offers, it comes to have meaning and to find its place in everyday life through the ways in which it's received and understood and interpreted. So one place that I looked for language about technology was advice columns, Ann Landers and Dear Abby, which was a great resource. If you think about it, in the 1990s, isn't that the best quote ever? In the 1990s, people were not using the internet by and large in every American home, right? It wasn't until 1995 that the internet became a really big deal. So Ann Landers and Dear Abby together reach 40 million Americans every single day in the newspaper. So if you think about it, if you're opening a newspaper in 1996 when minority of the American population is online, this might be the only place where you're seeing people discuss what are the relational impacts of this technology, right? At a time when it's becoming wildly important. And as you can see, there is a very deterministic and dystopian discourse dominating here, right? The internet is an insidious monster about to pounce on the American people, and it will destroy more marriages and lives than anything the world has ever known. It's called the internet. And Ann Landers, a few years later, in replying to somebody else, it happened to you too, my mail tells me that the internet may become the principal homewrecker of the next century. A hobby for many has turned into an addiction for others. So throughout the 1990s, when you look at how the internet gets represented in these advice columns, you see this very dystopian story about the damage it's doing to relationships, the harm it's doing to relationships. And this is a really, really common phenomenon with any new communication technology, that it's going to ruin us all. I mean, you can go, I guarantee you there's something on CNN today about how some new technology is destroying us, because it's always there. But what happened was really interesting, which is that readers started writing back saying, "Anne, I met my best friend on the internet. I met my husband on the internet. I'm part of a bird watching group, and we all collaborate on bird watching through the internet." And so you actually see this process of domestication, of something coming from being a novel, scary form that we don't know how to understand except to yell, "Danger, danger, danger," to being something nuanced and ordinary that we can all kind of live with. And the problems don't go away, but the rhetoric of the internet as the cause of trauma dissipates. And so by 2000, you start seeing messages like this. "Dear Anne, I've been living with Sherwin. We're planning to get married. Last weekend I discovered he posted a personal ad on an adult internet site. I confronted him. He admitted he posted the ad after our fight. He still wants to get married. Should I?" And what's interesting about this is the response, which does not say, "Oh, you too, huh? The internet is terrible," but says, "Sherwin doesn't understand the responsibilities and obligations of marriage. It would be a huge mistake to go through with the wedding. The next time he gets angry, he might run off with the neighbor's wife. Please reconsider before it's too late." No mention of the technology at all. The technology has become invisible, and there's now an understanding that if your marriage is falling apart, it's because you're having some problems. It's not because the technology was an insidious monster that pounced on you and destroyed your marriage.
Although there was just an op-ed or some article in the New York Times this past week where this woman was complaining that Craigslist broke up her marriage, but I mean, it was an op-ed piece, and it was one of the most widely cited. So
these discourses are not dead. It does. And I actually had on Twitter, Ann Landers' daughter is an advice columnist now. She actually lives here in Boston, and I had a back and forth with her on Twitter about this, and she said, judging from her mail, she's not totally convinced that it isn't a causal factor either. And I'm sure that, if your partner meets somebody on the internet, you're ready to blame the internet for it, but that's a whole lot easier than looking within, isn't it? So again, another example of how you can look at these small things and see these large social phenomena at play. Anything else I want to say about that? I'll just point out that around this time, the HomeNet study published a follow-up study showing that a year later, all of those effects had completely disappeared. And it's since been argued that what was actually happening was that people were so overwhelmed by trying to figure out how the computer and the internet worked that it made them feel totally crappy about themselves, and that's what all the increased depression and misery things were about people's self-efficacy and being able to manage this technology rather than the technology itself. So after a year, the loneliness stuff was totally gone. And also, the loneliness and depression findings that they found, it's not that they found that people were lonely or depressed, it's that they were an itty bit more lonely and an itty bit more depressed, but they were nowhere near clinical. So.
A piece in the Atlantic a few months ago claiming that a large fraction of all the published papers in psychology report effects that disappear.
Yes, that was a great article. It was the something effect. They've named it.
Yeah, right, the disappearing effect.
That's great. It had a weird name, but yes, that even in science, not just in psychology, in science.
Biology especially, right.
Yeah.
Really?
In more generally.
Well, that's science, really interesting. So I felt very validated by that. See, I told you were wrong. But if you think about this language and you think about policy, right, like some of the issues that Dana works on, right, if we have this rhetoric out there about children and the internet and what the internet is doing to children and what Facebook is doing to children, and these are the kinds of messages that people are seeing. It's not like our implementers are going and reading all of the research that's being done about it. They're listening to the voices around them, the links in the chain of speech communication, and policy decisions are being made based on these rhetorics. Yes?
Actually, one of the things I find interesting in this mail is I discovered he had posted a personal ad on an adult internet site. That she doesn't address that, but I feel like now, I guess I read these kind of columns occasionally. The first response is always, stop checking your partner's email.
Oh yeah, they hadn't even gotten to that. They hadn't even gotten to that.
And I realized like that's not a thing in 2002, but that's kind of a meme now.
That's true. That's true.
Just stop checking your partner's email.
Yeah, that whole question of spying, using technology to spy on your partner hadn't even surfaced at this time. That's true. Another place where you see really fun discourses about technology is cartoons. And I've looked at New Yorker cartoons. We met online, says this one. Of course, on the internet, Nobody Knows You're a Dog one is one of the most famous cartoons of all time. If you put that caption into Google, you get hundreds of thousands of hits. And it's been used to talk about everything. Whatever you want to say about the internet, you can use that dog cartoon to do it. My favorite riff on it was a couple of years ago. One came out and it took the same cartoon, but the caption said, "How the hell does Facebook know I'm a dog?" So, endless riffs, endless riffs. And I think this particular one raises a lot of the issues that I have looked at, right? Is it a real relationship? Can it possibly be a good relationship when it's on the internet? Can you really have good interactions when it's mediated? The parents here, I assume they're the parents, look mortified, right, that the boyfriend is on a computer. So I think the questions of embodiment, he can't drink the wine and eat the bowl of nuts, right? He's on a machine. What does this do to her interactions? Can this be a real relationship? Can this be considered quality? What's happening here? So these are issues that I've explored through a couple of surveys, one of college students at Kansas and elsewhere, and one through the social networking site Last.fm, which is a music-based social networking site. And Last.fm has the nice quality that when you bring up your friends page, like on Facebook, when you bring up your profile, your friends appear in random order. So I managed to work with the people who ran the site to post a survey, an official survey, and they stickied it so it was always at the top of the forum. And I asked people, bring up your profile and let's fill this out with regard to the first person on your friends list here to look at what is a friend on Last.fm? What is that? One funny side effect was that a lot of people wrote and said, I wish you'd given me a different friend. I wish I could, because I have much better examples. But of course, that was sort of the point. So yay, randomization. So there's a lot of concern when we talk about how does social media affect relationships, that there's a substitution effect going on, right? That if we're communicating with people via Facebook, we're not communicating with them face to face, right? So this is, I don't expect you to read all these numbers and think about it, but this is what media do you use to communicate with your partner, right? And how is that correlated with one another? And the only thing that I want you to take away from this is that almost everything except Last.fm and face-to-face communication are positively correlated. They're all positively correlated. There are no negative correlations. Using any one medium means you're more likely to use any other medium. And no medium takes away. So there isn't. Now, this doesn't speak to how often or how much time, but it does speak to what are the different modes through which you communicate. And what you see here, and I'll have other things to say about this in a minute, is that using any medium makes you more likely to use others. Using any medium, there is no medium that you use that therefore makes you less likely to do something else. There is no trade-off between social media and face-to-face interaction in these data. There's still this really profound rhetoric, and this speaks to a lot of the issues. These are excerpts from the survey of college students where I had an open-ended question, and all the open-ended question said was, in general, how would you compare your feelings about communicating face-to-face, online, and on the telephone? And they almost always came back with a ranking, even though I hadn't asked for a ranking, but they came back with a ranking, which says a lot about sort of the psychology of how we understand these media right there. And And they almost all sounded like they were coming from the very same psychological script, right? They didn't know media richness theory, but they had all internalized it, which is face-to-face is personal, phone is personal, but not as intimate. The internet is the least personal. And this whole rhetoric is all about nonverbal communication, that when we don't have access to nonverbal cues, we can't express emotion adequately. So this got me interested in the question of, is it true? Right? Is online interaction really not as good? So you would think that if you gave these same people a survey and you said, okay, think of the most recent significant voluntary social interaction you've had, and a third of them got face-to-face, and a third of them got online, and a third of them got on the phone. What you ought to see, if they're right in their self-understanding, is that the face-to-face interactions are best, and then the phone interactions are next, and then the internet's way down there somewhere. That's not what happened. So what I did was I did exactly that. And they had a 4-point scale on a scale of 1 to 5 to rank on each of these to what extent was this conversation boring, interesting, satisfying, dissatisfying. I mean, not 1 to 5, but a semantic differential. Distanced, intimate, unpleasant, pleasant. So if the rhetoric that they've all bought into is correct, you ought to see that face-to-face interaction is interesting, satisfying, intimate, and pleasant, and internet interactions are they might be interesting, but they shouldn't be satisfying, and they certainly shouldn't feel intimate. And I mean, they explicitly use the word intimate. But that's not what happened. What happened was that telephone and face-to-face were identical, statistically identical in quality. And internet was lower in quality. It was 1/4 of a point on a 5-point scale lower. And I think 4% of that variance was accounted for by medium. So the raw numbers were that the average face-to-face conversation was a 3.94 on a 5-point scale. A telephone was a 3.99, and the internet was all the way down there at a 3.75. Right? So they were high-quality interactions, even on the internet. What actually the biggest predictor of a conversation being low in quality was that you were talking to an acquaintance. So the moral I take from this is, if you're really concerned with only having high-quality interactions, don't talk to acquaintances.
When you say quality, is it a combination of all these?
Right, because they were highly intercorrelated. They were intercorrelated so highly that we just collapsed them into one measure. Yeah. So you can see, I mean, one thing that you can take from this is that there's a disconnect between our rhetorics of technologies and our actual experiences of them, which is very common. You know, people have disconnects, but we think that we're miserable with our life, but actually it's raining, right? So we're not necessarily very good at self-understanding. And I think this is an example of that, and it's another example of the power of messages about technology to really shape how we think about it. Another point that I take from this is that people have a very strong tendency to romanticize face-to-face communication and to imagine that every time we have a face-to-face communication, we're looking into one another's eyes and having a communion of the spirit, right? Whereas in fact, a lot of our face-to-face conversations are pretty boring and stupid, and we'd rather be doing something else, and we're tired of hearing about the relationship problems or whatnot. So I think our public discourse is characterized by a very romantic vision of face-to-face communication that is very problematic. The fact that there's so little difference amongst the qualities of these interactions, I think, also speaks to the limit of technology in shaping the quality of an interaction. Mike?
Good question. Did it come out in any of these measures of quality? But so face-to-face has an opportunity to have different modalities happening, so having nonverbals and
right.
prosody and intonation and stuff that you might get. But it strikes me there's another way of thinking about face-to-face, which is also about sort of embodiment and sort of investment, and the fact that you were physically present and you were there and you weren't sort of doing something else while you were on the phone and the internet. So it's not just about the modality that you might be communicating in a particular context, but it's also about the amount of investment or physical presence that actually has meaning in itself, separate from the
At times, but on the other hand, think about how often you've had a conversation with somebody because you were walking down the street and so were they, and you bumped into each other. And it didn't represent any investment. It represented we're stuck in this moment and it would be rude not to talk to each other, right? So there are times when it represents investment. There's also times that if I sit down and I write you a long email, that also represents an investment, right? So I wouldn't want to say that face-to-face has a unique potential for, let me backtrack. I do believe face-to-face interaction has all kinds of unique potential. I mean, for one thing, it's got touch, which I don't know any of us who are ever willing to sacrifice all touch in our lives. That's incredibly powerful, and embodiment is incredibly powerful. But I wouldn't want to accord it the only status as the only mode through which things like commitment can be assessed and created, right?
So the investment could easily be a minus rather than a plus.
Mm-hmm.
I'm stuck here.
Absolutely, absolutely. And not just I'm stuck here, but I'm flustered, and therefore I'm not able to express myself well, or I'm blushing and giving myself away, and therefore I don't feel mastery over my identity. So there's all kinds of ways in which there's problems that arise because of the face-to-face context that technologies can actually ameliorate. But it certainly suggests that there's not a magic deterministic thing happening here where internet causes this, telephone causes that, face-to-face causes that. If nothing else, it shows it's way messier than that. So then the other question out of this whole body of things is, what about the quality of the relationship? So with the Last.fm stuff, I didn't develop it, but there's an 18-item scale to measure how developed a relationship is, and each question on it is based on these six dimensions of relationships, that as a relationship develops, people become more interdependent. So questions like, I consult with this person before making plans. Depth and breadth of self-disclosure, we discuss a wide range of topics. I've told this person something about me that I tell very few people. Private communication, we have secret nicknames and words that we use with each other. The sense of knowing each other, I can finish this person's sentences before they do. The shared social networks, we know a lot of people in common. I've introduced this person to my friends and family. And relational commitment, even if it took a lot of effort, I would do what it took to make this relationship last, those kinds of issues. So the Last.fm respondents were asked to assess the relationship based on these items. And we had, my collaborator and I did a 4-step hierarchical regression analysis to see what predicted the quality of relationships. So we started with things like, are you same-sex or are you cross-sex? Do you live in the same country? How old are you? Those kinds of matters. And added in other things. And then we added in that, you saw that matrix a little bit ago, of what media do you use to communicate with one another in this relationship. And what we found was that the most important predictor by far, and a very, very powerful predictor, it accounted for 64% of the variance in how developed the relationship was, and it made everything else, all those other demographic things I just mentioned, completely disappear in terms of significance, was how many media do you use to communicate? More media, more developed relationship. Fewer media, less developed relationship. So, and that was regardless of which medium it was.
I mean, obviously, I mean, what's the causation here? Like, obviously, if you're very close to someone, then you would communicate and then. So
yeah, I'm not making an argument about causality.
Yes.
At the same time, if you buy into this idea that communication is creating relationships, there is no cause and effect. Every effect is a cause, right? So yes, I'm getting closer to you, and therefore I'm going to friend you on Facebook now, right? And then we're getting even closer, so we're going to start talking on the telephone. Yes, it's a result of our feeling closer, but at the same time, the fact that we now also talk on the phone brings us closer still. So I would say the causality goes both directions. But I'm certainly not implying that, hey, if you just become Facebook friends, you'll be closer, right? It's a back and forth process here. Every single medium contributed the same, too. So it wasn't like if you communicated face-to-face, then you got a really big boost in closeness, whereas the email only gave you a little tiny one. They were all sort of pretty much equal in how much they contributed statistically to explaining the variance in relational development.
And I assume this was among young people?
No.
Or
Well, yes and no. This was the Last.fm survey. So that survey, there were about 500 150 respondents. They were from 41 different countries, and they ranged and aged from 18 to 57.
But
they
were
did average
technologically
young.
savvy in that they
Yes.
used Last
Yes.
FM. Like
Yes.
your grandmother, my grandmother's dead, but my mother, okay, doesn't use all these things
Right.
just because
Absolutely.
she's, technologically completely illiterate. So you were selecting for people who could.
I was selecting for people who had social network friends, right? Because the question was, what is a social network? This was in response to this whole discourse of people don't know how to have friendships anymore because they have MySpace friends.
But if your grandmother is not using Facebook, doesn't mean she doesn't have as good friends as these other people. It's more that these people who are using these media still have good friends.
Right.
Right. And in fact, that their use of this media is contributing to the strength of those friendships, which is not to say that the others are not as good, but
Just what's the typical length of a friend? What's the typical number of friends that the Last FM user had?
oh gosh, I don't remember that offhand. It was not especially high.
Which
And
is
there was
better for you
huge
because,
variance.
like, I imagine in Facebook, if you take 550 people and choose a random friend out of the list, it might be not how to get a representative sample.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It was an enormous range of what sorts of relationships were going on here. It was everything from the mom who had Last FM friended her kid who went off to college, to the people who worked side by side at desks and were friends so that they could tease each other about the music that they listened to people who had met on a discussion forum someplace else. More than half of the Last FM friends did not first encounter one another on Last FM, had created a Last FM friendship based on already knowing each other from someplace else.
I would not suspect that actually size would matter because of the kinds of relationships that are formed in these different kind of media. So the likelihood on Facebook that you actually have a good understanding of that person, because it's very little, Facebook is less likely to be interest-driven, Facebook is more likely to be acquaintance-driven, whereas Last FM is more likely to have a mixture of different things because it's an interest-driven space.
Right.
Yes, but I guess
And in that regard, it's interesting that half of the friendships were relationship-driven to start off with. All right. So again, I think this is going to close this phase of my research before I move into the most research stuff. Well, actually, let me say one other point, which is not from this work, but from a recent study that I did with my colleague Jeff Hall, looking at use of the mobile phone and how that affects relational development. So looking at these same outcome variables. And we did that survey with the friend who who you communicate with using the mobile phone the most. And the question was, we were looking at the idea that the mobile phone simultaneously would increase how interdependent you could be, but that it also has that entrapment quality of I can't go anywhere without telling this person, or this person telling me I can't get away from this friend. So we did a survey where we measured entrapment and mobile phone use and relational development along these variables, and we did a structural equation model to look at it, which allows you to sort of parse out what are the different variables and what is the order of flow. You can get a little more causal in looking at it. And what we found was that using a mobile phone with your friend you use the mobile phone with the most increased how interdependent you felt, and that increased the quality of relationship along these measures. At the same time, it increased how entrapped you felt, and that decreased the quality of the relationship. So with that and with all that I've been talking about here, I think the big upshot here is, again, the medium isn't creating this. Media have different kinds of effects. They can have different kinds of contradictory effects simultaneously. There isn't, if you use this technology, this happens. It's a big, messy thing. Technologies don't determine relational outcomes, but they become important parts of how those relationships are made. All right, so then it all kind of came back together in that I had been interested in these questions of how do relationships work, how does technology figure into relationships, and I had been interested in these questions of audience. And back when I was doing this research around Usenet, the entertainment industries didn't actually really even know that the internet was out there. And on those rare occasions when they did know the internet was out there, they thought, oh, they're just a bunch of geeks, right? Who cares about them and what they have to say? They're inconsequential. And obviously that has just radically, radically changed, where now there is no entertainment company out there that isn't incredibly worried about how to deal with the internet and how to deal with these organized fans who have their own opinions and who are completely disrupting their industries. So I got interested in this in the context of the music industry. I had been doing this Last FM work. I like music a lot. I was interested in music. But music is also, Yochai Benkler talks about music as, he says, you know, the fact that these disruptions happened around music first is just a historical accident because MP3 files are so small. But these are disruptions that are going to run through every kind of industry. So it's a great sort of bleeding edge case to look at for these larger kinds of social and cultural dynamics that are happening. So I was interested in questions around what are audiences doing around music online? How do musicians and labels view that? And in particular, not the EMI, Rest in Peace, or Sony's, or Universal's, but independent music too. You'll see in a minute. I was interested in a particular scene with really different dynamics. And I'm also interested in then how does the fact of direct interaction affect the relationship between musicians and audiences from the point of view of the musicians, people who don't usually get talked to about these things? If you think about the rhetoric around the music industry, it's very contradictory in that you have, on the one hand, piracy, 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 right? And certainly on a policy level, that's the dominant discourse, is these people are stealing music on the internet and it's destroying business. But at the same time, there's a very powerful rhetoric of connect with your fans online, right? That you have to connect and build relationships with your fans on the internet. So these are sort of, you know, on the one hand, the internet, scary, 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 and on the other hand, great opportunity to connect with your fans. And in fact, if you don't use the internet to connect with your fans, then you're probably doomed, right? You'll never make money. So the internet is in sort of this odd space in the entertainment industries where it's simultaneously a terrible threat and also something you have to do or you won't have opportunity. Butler?
What happened historically? The impression I have is that the piracy thing came first and it took a while for people to realize that the connection thing was important too. Is that true?
It did, and the reason that that's true is that the industry is following the audiences. Right? The audiences were already connected to each other. The audiences were already doing unauthorized sharing. I hate the word piracy for a lot of, as somebody who believes that language creates reality. I used it quoting them, right? Because that is the dominant rhetorical term.
I was going to say stealing.
Right? Yeah, well, I don't think that metaphor works either because it's still there. Right? It's still there. But I mean, we can unpack
separate discussion about
we can unpack the metaphors around it. But you know, definitely people are not boarding ships and raping and pillaging and taking things away that are therefore no longer there. There is
wants to be free.
As in, what is the line? Free as in beer or free as in speech? Speech. Okay. Thank you. I just remembered the beer part. Shame on me. Okay. So I started out looking at this through the context of the fans of independent Swedish music. And this came about for rather personal reasons having to do with the fact that I was in the middle of Kansas falling in love with Swedish independent pop bands who didn't have US contracts, who were not on the radio, and within a year or so I was able to become quite an expert in this scene, and this kind of blew me away, right? How can I be sitting in Kansas knowing more about Swedish independent music than most people do, when none of those mainstream media channels that are supposed to be so important for music distribution, for entertainment distribution, are at play here? And the answer to that question comes back to online community, which is that on the internet there are a lot of people who are very passionate about independent Swedish music and who, as fans, are doing a lot of things to promote it. So it goes back to this question of fan community and what are fans doing online. Fan community looks really different now in that it's not necessarily situated in single sites. You still have single sites that are really, really important for talking about entertainment. You have forums that have very strong senses of group identity in all those ways that we saw with the soap opera group. But you also have this sort of, I've called it networked collectivism, where as a group they're networked through a variety of different sites. So these are some examples of the sites around Swedish music that were interesting to me as I came to start thinking about this. This first site, Hello Surprise, was an archive. So you have a fan building an archive of independent Swedish music. Every single item on here is a Swedish independent band. And every one of these is a Swedish independent label. And if you click on any one of these, it would bring up a biography of the band and links to any MP3s that that band had made available for sharing. So they were not, he wasn't making things available that the artists or labels had not made available, but he was organizing them all in one place. So you could go here and you could learn everything you could listen to any Swedish independent band. This is before Spotify. This is before streaming sites were really happening. It's a Trap. Hello Surprise was actually run by a Swede. It's a Trap is still, it's 10 years old now, is run by a guy in Olympia, Washington, and every single day except weekends he posts news items, small little news items about Swedish or Scandinavian music, and huge resource in the Scandinavian music industry. Fan, system administrator, works at home, does this in his spare time every single day for the last 10 years. Swedes Please is a blog run by a guy in Chicago, has also been around for many years now, where he posts his favorite Swedish music and writes a little biography about them. So Sweden, really small country, right? 8 million people, population, wildly successful music scene, just wildly disproportionately successful. If you're going by population, it's right behind the United States and the United Kingdom in international music success. And I would argue that part of that is because of ABBA, part of that is because of Roxette, but a lot of that is because of these kinds of things where you have audiences redistributing things and building awareness of these different bands that are out there and so on.
When you say right behind the US and the UK, is that measured by revenue or number of people who?
Revenue. Or, yeah.
Is that higher than Iceland? Just a geeky question. Because I know Iceland's right up there as well.
It's been a while since those figures have been run. My guess is yes. My guess would be yes. I mean, Iceland's got, well, we can talk music, but Iceland has a couple of super successful acts. Sweden's got a lot of really successful, and a lot of acts that people have no idea are Swedish because they're all singing in English, right? So people don't even know. Like, what? Peter, Bjorn, and John are Swedish? Bjorn! One thing that's really interesting to me about this also, though, is that you see, with the changes in technology, new opportunities for audiences to take on roles that they really didn't take before. So you have Swedes Please serving as curator, as publicist. You have It's a Trap serving as primary journalistic source. You have Hello Surprise serving as librarian, right? So you have all of them together serving as cultural ambassadors, right? Really increasing cultural flows. And both the guy who runs It's a Trap and who runs Swede Please have been brought to Sweden by the Swedish government to talk about cultural exports and so on. So all kinds of new social positions being occupied by audiences because of the activities that they're engaging in online. So this is a scene where when you look at the labels and you look at the musicians, you did not get resistance. You did not get the sense of a threat. So I want to read you an extended excerpt from a blog post that was put up by one of the guys who runs this small Swedish label called Hybris, or Hybris as I'd call it, where this post was on their blog, and it was about how they were not going to talk to the media anymore as long as the media were obsessed with file sharing, that they didn't want to talk about that anymore. And so what he says is, this issue is about our whole culture, you know, that itsy-bitsy thing that separates us from being ants. The way culture is built today is through file sharing. There are loads of things file sharing has an impact on, irreversible impact, like how one builds one's identity. There's communities, blogs, websites with loads of information, free information of high and low, the lowest quality everywhere, all the time, and it is increasing by the minute. It's stressful, high-paced, superficial, and at times very rewarding. It's a world of culture undergoing change at a level so basic that it probably will have replaced the old system completely in a couple of years. 4 years counting from last Thursday is our guess. The change is exactly like the change when Copernicus told people that the universe doesn't spin around the world. It's exactly like that. Now, obviously, very utopian, over-the-top discourse, but at the same time, think back to all those quotes that I began with, right? A recognition that file sharing is not just about moving music around, it's about creating culture. It's about transforming relationships, transforming identities, and to pigeonhole it as a solely economic problem is to misunderstand the cultural dynamics that are at play as these materials move around through the internet. If you think about this as a link in this complexly organized chain of speech communication, you can think of it spiraling out, linking out also to open access movements, to open source movements. All of these things are interrelated in ways tangential and direct. And in fact, the guy who runs Hybris and the guy who runs another label share office space with one of the 4 Pirate Bay founders. So there's some very direct connections around many of these things. At this point, and we're coming toward the end here, at this point I got interested in questions of, well, what do musicians think about all of this, and not just in Sweden, but more broadly? How is their sense of relationship changing? So for the last couple of years, in a project that I actually started here when I was here summer before last, I've been interviewing musicians about how they understand social media and their relationships with audiences more broadly. So this is a guy, Mark Kelly, who's in a band who've been together about 25 years from the UK called Marillion. They were, I think, the first band to ever fan fund themselves, which happened by accident. The audience said, why don't you ever tour North America? And they said, well, we'd need 60,000 pounds to do it. And they said, we'll raise the money. And they said, yeah, go ahead, sure, if you do that, we'll come. And they did. And then he had to tell the rest of the band. But they've fan funded almost all of their albums since then. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff around that, including how angry the fans were when they decided to pay for their own album instead of asking the fans to invest in it up front. He hits on what, again, to me is so interesting about social media, which is this moment of disruption where people are still trying to find out where to draw the boundaries and what works and what doesn't. This whole question of what is the new normal? How do we do this? What's okay? What's not okay? He got in trouble with his wife because he tweeted that he'd had a vasectomy, and she didn't think that was in the least bit appropriate. Another example of a great tweet that demonstrates boundaries and inappropriateness. And do we really want this from our musicians? Is this funny? Is this great? Is this building personal relationship? Is this gross and disgusting? 8 people retweeted it. I thought it was hilarious, personally. But again, can you imagine, Mick Jagger in the 1960s, having a shit on the plane, on the jet? No, that was not, maybe having wild sex and lots of drugs on the jet, but pooping? Gross. Too human. Right? And this idea that the rock star, the musician, as somebody shrouded in mystique, somebody very different from us, somebody unknowable and unapproachable, really breaking down. And that's why I like this tweet, is because it tears away all mystique, right? It says we are all fundamentally human, right? We all poop. There's nothing special about me. So what I would argue is that what's happening through social media with audiences and musicians is that the relationship is becoming much less hierarchical, much less about I'm down here and you're up there, or I'm up here and you're down there, which many musicians are embracing and others are finding really problematic. And that those relationships are becoming more interpersonal, less economic and more interpersonal, which is part of why the whole connect with your fans becomes so important. Because if I can take your music for free, why would I pay for it? Because you like me, and I like you, and I wouldn't want to let you down. You're a real person. You poop. For some people, this is Roger O'Donnell, who was a member of The Cure for 10 years, so huge band, played stadiums. He's made enough money now, even though he eventually got kicked out of the band. He doesn't ever have to work again. He's sitting really, really pretty. He experiences, he's now, you've got actually the best shirt because he's now all about playing the Moog synthesizer. He does this like instrumental, sad music on his synthesizer. And he talked to me about how making music is such a lonely process, right? And to be able to get these emails from audience members and to talk to them throughout the day, suddenly it's not lonely anymore. Now it's engaged. And it's not, they're not fans anymore, they're friends now, right? So you have this real blurring between when is it a fan and when is it a friend, and what does that mean, and what are its limits? For other people, the last thing in the world they want is to be friends with their audience. They want very clear boundaries. You're my audience, and I'm the artist, and never the twain shall meet. And sometimes that's about being a private person and just feeling like I don't want to share that much about myself with that many people. And sometimes it's about a belief that music requires mystique in order to have its magic, and that if you take that away and you know that the performers are just real people, ordinary people like you, then the music won't be able to work its magic on you in the same way. For a lot of the people that I've spoken with, one of the really interesting things about the internet has been that there was always audience community around them, right? The audiences were always engaging each other as fans of so-and-so, but the artists never had access to that community before. They could never really be part of it. They were always separate from it. And now they can be right in the middle of it. They can be part of it. They can be engaged with the community. So this is Roseanne Cash. This is a Twitter exchange. Roseanne is, you know, a very, very successful performing artist in her own right, also daughter of Johnny. Couldn't have asked her for a better quote. I said, you know, I want to know if Twitter changes how you understand, feel about, relate to your audience, because she tweets all the time. She's a vociferous tweeter. And she replies, I don't think about it as audience, more community. So you see these shifts, right? I don't think of them as fans, I think of them as friends. I don't think of them as audience, I think of them as community, right? And these shifts are coming about because of the kinds of direct interaction that social media have afforded and the way these artists are using them. And I think there are economic consequences, too, in the sense that if you become part of a community, you want to be engaged with that community. And even if you don't like the record that somebody put out, you're still going to buy it, because how else are you going to talk about it with the community? So, for example, I spoke with Billy Bragg, who's been a successful performer for almost 30 years now. And he, well, maybe, yeah, it is almost 30. Hope. He talked about people who come to his shows and he knows that they haven't liked anything he's put out in 10 years because they've told him, but they wouldn't miss his shows because that's where their friends are, right? So as we think about what's going to sustain careers over the long haul, building that kind of community is clearly going to be a really important piece of that, and social media are going to continue to be really central to that ability to build community. For the artists, of course, it means they have to negotiate their position vis-a-vis the community, right? Because they can't just be the leader. Bragg talks about it as building a social framework within which his audience can interact. Some of the artists find that the audience doesn't actually even care about them that much. You know, like there are some bands like Marillion, that first one I showed a couple of slides ago, where their fans actually have get-togethers where 3,000 people will go to Canada or will go to Germany, and they do this almost every year. And the band will go, and for like 5 minutes, it's like, oh my God, it's Mark Kelly, and then they forget about it, and they're like, yeah, I'm talking to my friends. So they have to negotiate sort of what is their position relative to one another in different kinds of ways. You can also think about what are the roles for middlemen if artists can connect directly to audience. And for me, this is in many ways the most powerful piece of this whole puzzle, which is that what happens when the audience are creative forces in their own right, when they've got technologies that allow them to create. So this is Kristen Hirsch from Throwing Muses and some other bands and a solo artist talking about the kinds of creative things that audiences do with her music. And she says, I didn't know they'd be willing, she's saying, you know, I knew they'd buy the records. I didn't know they'd be willing to come through with their own projects, like remixes of my songs, time-lapse paintings to my music, films, covers, all of that sharing they do, all that effort and all that involvement. It's one thing to be made someone's soundtrack for a while. That is truly the highest honor I could ever hope to achieve. And they go one step closer to making the music together by actually making the music together. So for her, it's a, again, back to the Copernican shift, right? It's about creating a new kind of culture. It's about creating a new kind of collaboration where it's not the artist delivering content to the audience, it's a communal activity, which if you think about the history of music and of creativity, actually is a return to how it always was rather than a brand new phenomenon. The recording industry tends to forget that they're a short historical blip and that it used to be that people got together and played music together, not that we went to the store to buy music. That starts with the play your piano. Music
How
goes.
different is the new world from the world of 200 years ago?
Well, it's very different in that it is delocalized,
Yeah, sure.
right? And it's on much larger scales and much more niche-y. Gosh, I mean, I could talk about that for hours. There are ways in which it's very similar in that things can be more collaborative. We're seeing in some ways returns to patronage models from a few hundred years ago also, where fans are funders or people are using Kickstarter to get funding for things. So the live performance is more critical than ever, as it used to be, right? You have to be a wandering minstrel now. You can't just sit there and sell your records through your label. Having a powerful patron really helps. So yeah, that's an interesting question to think about. But I
Studied this question systematically?
no,
Okay.
no. And in fact, I mean, it's really kind of discouraging. But like I was here in April, and I went to this Rethink Music conference at the Berklee School of Music and Berkman Center and MEDEM, which is the biggest European music trade show organization, sponsored. And I, at one point, pointed out that the recording industry was a relatively brief historical time, and that the purpose of music, if you thought back for as long as music had been around, was social connection between people. And the audience burst into applause because this was such a radical notion to them, that music wasn't about selling product, but was about human connection, right? And it was powerful for them to hear somebody say that, which to me is incredibly sad, but also speaks volumes about the current state of industries in facing the internet, right? Connection, whoa, what a thought. Okay, so the other thing that this quote speaks to that I hear a lot about is that it's not just, when we talk about participatory culture, which is a phrase that we hear a lot around social media these days, it's not just that people are participating with each other and that people are participating by making content, a very problematic term. It's that people are participating in the creative process, and people are participating in the emotional and relational lives of each other, including the artists, the people that we're rallying around. So, I'm wrapping up here. Later in the essay, Bakhtin puts it this way. He says, every utterance is a link in the chain of speech communion. People tend to forget that the root of communication as a word is communion, right? It's the means through which we come together, through which we establish a shared reality. So what I've tried to do in this talk is to talk about the ways in which messages in social media serve as links in this chain of speech communion that bring new kinds of contexts into being, that reshape existing contexts, that return us to historical contexts, that this kind of communion comes about through communication, and that social media are a key piece of these complexly organized change, not in any kind of simple way, but in really messy, complicated ways that can go all kinds of different directions depending on all kinds of factors that are out there. So I don't think of social media as good or as bad or as agents of change. I think of them as phenomena that open up some possibilities, that are discussed in ways that shape how they're used, that through the ways in which they are used, which are almost always surprising to their creators, transform the possibilities of what we can do with them and the relationships and cultures and communities that get built around them. Anything else I want to say? Ooh, I ended too fast. What happened? I don't even know what that was.
We saw that.
Okay. I just had a thank you. My whirling tour, my whirling dervish tour. All righty. So I don't know how I did on time there, but I hope there's still time for questions.
For a couple of questions.
I'm sorry. Ms. Kate?
Thank you, Nancy. That was great. It was a really nice unpacking of a lot of the kinds of extremes that we hear around with internet research and social media research. But one of the other kind of really boring dualities that I think exists in studies around music and fans is this focus on digital means production. So you brought up those fantastic lists of Swedish musicians, and we heard Kristen Hirsch from Throwing Muses talk about how remix and producing things digitally is really significant, and how MP3s circulate. But there seems to be this real bias towards thinking about digital modes of production, whereas another thing that's happened really significantly with these kinds of communities is the return to older analog forms of media production. So the resurgence of vinyl, for example, has partly come about through the fact that people have been teaching each other how to cut, basic white plates, and this resurgence of cassettes as a really cheap way to again, it's really strange, all the hit labels are now making cassettes. So there's been this really interesting resurgence of old analog media production methods that seems to get lost in this kind of celebration of digital connectivity and file sharing and remixing. Is that something that you're going to look at, or is that something that some of these musicians talked about in your interviews?
They don't talk about that, no. What some of them talk about is the increased importance of the concert as an analog embodied experience that comes to have more value when the music comes in a form that's so much more ephemeral. So that some of them feel like if you don't have a record in your hand, if there's nothing tangible to hold around the music, that going and being in the same physical space with the musicians becomes more important than it used to be. And I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, the questions that I ask are about how they understand their audience and their relationships with their audience. I'm not asking about means of production or means of distribution or those kinds of questions. So
I'm just curious, because this idea of that there's no object, so now the concept becomes this replacement for connection and closeness. Is exactly the same time historically that we've seen this resurgence of vinyl, which is an object that circulates.
Right. I mean, and we've also seen a return to the handmade special edition of something, right? So I think that there is definitely, and the rise of Etsy and crafty culture in general. So I think that on a larger scale, there is a kind of yearning for analog and return to sort of folksy, do-it-yourself, make stuffiness that's going on that is a reaction to the digitalization of so much and the ephemerality of so much culture. So I think that's part of that whole dynamic.
I don't know if you looked at all about, so you've been talking about like the interaction between the musicians and the audience, but I don't know if you've looked at music criticism at all. Because I feel like maybe a few years ago, there are a bunch of people who are saying, oh, it'll be more democratized now that everyone can provide content. But instead, and maybe this is just my experience, I feel like it's just a bunch of blogs where everyone's parroting Pitchfork or Coke Machine Glow or something.
Yeah, it's amazing how fast Pitchfork suddenly became Rolling Stone.
And yeah, well,
that's
what I was
to the
now
middle.
they're the tastemakers of Rolling Stone, and even so, and Pitchfork has no forum or no commenting mechanism.
Right.
So I feel like there's this promise that maybe there's going to be a more community aspect of music criticism, but that never, maybe you found that.
I feel two ways about that. On the one hand, I think hierarchy always reasserts itself, right? I don't think we ever get to an egalitarian place. I think that there's always social order shakes out and some actors end up on top, and Pitchfork are clearly the winners in this moment in time in that regard. You don't have to go back very far to say, oh, Pitchfork, they're just a bunch of outsider amateurs, right? And so the speed at which they were able to ascend to the key tastemakers for hipster culture was really something. At the same time, I would disagree in that if you go to Hype Machine, man, there are so many blogs doing music criticism. And you have these niche things like It's a Trap that are doing all kinds of music criticism. And you have music criticism of all kinds of music that Pitchfork doesn't want to go near, you know. So you have resurgence of things like communities built around Brazilian jazz that's been out of print for 30 years, you know, so you have resuscitation of movements that have kind of gotten lost in music criticism around that. And I will say, I went to the Experience Music Project this year, and I think it was at that event, I'm pretty sure it was at that event. Music critics are still running terribly scared, right? It's not like they're saying, oh, okay, we're set, there's no threat. They're really pissed off about social media, and they really think that music criticism is dying, and that amateurs can't do it right, that they haven't, it's exactly the same as the journalism dialogue, right? That they have the necessary skills, they have the necessary talent, and those little people can't possibly do it right. And I think that if it were the case that music criticism was not threatened by these things, that they wouldn't be sweating so hard.
Let us thank Nancy.
Thank you. It was fun.